lower than what we include the second part. Good point. Pues, así como compartiendo la pantalla. Ah, eso solo le pasa. Just yeah. Of course. Yeah. Is it okay if it can edit? Yeah. Okay. Just. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm attending the meeting through Zoom. It's for me a pleasure to open this workshop that will start by a panel presented by, well, more than a panel, a presentation by Professor Dr. Martin Wenz, who is a professor of national and international tax law and holds the chair of business taxation and the laws of international of Liechtenstein taxation of the University of Liechtenstein. His main research interests are international tax architecture and the redesign of tax systems, international tax standards, and the international level playing field of taxation. The international tax treaties of individuals, companies, complex private and wealth structures, and the various aspects of Liechtenstein tax law. Professor Wenz gives also comprehensive advises to the Liechtenstein government on national and international tax law, including double tax agreement, and on the implementation of international standards, including Pillar 2, which is the focus of the second part of our workshop. The workshop will be structured in two parts. The first part, Professor Martin Wenz will introduce us to some of the challenge and opportunities on international taxation. And then we are going to have a panel with Professor Martin, also Suraya Arevalo, Oscar Muneva, Maite Escribano, and me, in which we are going to discuss Pillar 2 and what is its effect on developing countries, and also what's happening under the EU directive and what is going to be the impact of it in countries such as Colombia. Welcome to the session, and well, now the floor is all yours, Professor Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good afternoon, wherever you listen to us. Thank you very much, Dr. Yono Ojeda, and also Professor Jose Manuel Castro Arango, for having me here my second time at Universidad Externado de Colombia in Bogota. Yeah, I quite enjoyed my time always in Colombia, in Bogota and elsewhere, and it's great to be back. Yeah, today it's my pleasure to speak about different topics. We put it under a general topic, challenges and opportunities in international taxation. And first, I would like to go more into detail and to talk about the international tax framework, international tax competition, and a little bit on the implementation of Pillar 2. And Pillar 2, I think, will then be the core focus in the second part of this morning up to noon session. Do we have a clicker for the slides? Perfect. Super. Thank you very much. So yeah, it's my pleasure to start to give an outline about topics like the framework, the tax framework, international tax framework, also international tax competition and implementation of Pillar 2. And I don't want to bore you with the details you see here. So let's go through these topics, and then I think we will come along insofar. Well, we talk a lot about the so-called level playing field on international taxation, and if you see, this is a complex thing. Otherwise, the slide wouldn't be that packed. The idea is in principle very simple, in a way of let's have a common level playing field, like a playground for different players, and let's have kind of unique rules for the different players. Who are the players? Players are countries. Players are, of course, more organizations, but also players in a way are the ones who use all these rules, individuals, companies, multinationals, in a kind of an indirect version. Of course, the prime players are the jurisdictions. And how did they do for decades? Well, especially we are the OECD, and then later on supported by G7, G20. They try to figure out these kind of rules for their members, and also for all the other jurisdictions and countries on the globe. And this was more or less for a long time, let's say, the development of the level playing field. Of course, most important were the national tax laws and also the bilateral tax treaties. Then we came in a time where topics arose, financial crisis has been taken place, and many other topics, and so this was all challenged in a double way, challenged by the system, challenged by the economy, challenged by crisis, but also challenged by the big players, and this is still the situation today. If you have a look in alphabetic order, China, the EU, India, United States, just to mention maybe the most important one. There are other important ones, of course. In a way, they force the level playing field, but also they challenge the level playing field in the same time. Also, the level playing field in a way was challenged because there are many questions arose. How is this level playing field? In which favor is it? Is it really kind of equal? Is everybody included? And with regard to the rule setting, and many organizations, a lot of them linked to the so-called global South, also challenged it. Institutions, NGOs, and so on. And you see some of them on the right-hand side, including some research / political institutions. This came up then that many countries, the majority of countries, and you see the voting result in this map, was in favor of that the UN may take over in so far. And exactly in this process we are still. So we see on top still the G7, the G20, the OECD, but also the UN, and there's a kind of a competition to say, so who is the prime rule setter, who is the standard setter in so far, and who takes precedence. We see international standards. They have been developed, also kind of European standards in favor or regarding Europe, the European Union especially, but also with an impact on non-European countries. And of course, this is in a way challenged by globalization and digitalization, but also if it comes to individuals, then by topics like mobility and beyond. And we see in a way three core focus groups, to say so. It's the multinationals. For a long time, they were accused very often for tax avoidance, for base erosion, profit shifting, and much more. But also more and more individuals, ultra high net worth individuals especially, and so-called hubs, investment hubs or wealth hubs, maybe also philanthropic hubs. So this is the core focus. If we, or maybe just to come back, and we see this level playing field, it's becoming, or it is, and it became very dynamic, because we have these kind of international standards. But this is not the end of the story, and every country jurisdiction complies with these international standards. But every country or many country jurisdictions started to think about their role in the level playing field, and wouldn't it be a good idea to change the national tax laws? And so today we have this dynamic in the international tax standards, but we also have this, let's say, super dynamic regard to these many countries, these many national countries that are within this level playing field with tax reforms all over the world, and so on and so on. So a very, very dynamic process, and with that, of course, also a kind of a fragmented process. Again, if we have a look on the impact of these four players, just to mention these four. Having said that, focus on multinationals, we see this kind of a picture, and I think it's quite a kind of a structure how companies, how multinationals are in a way organized. Of course, much more complex with thousands of companies. But in a way, this is, let's say, the principle of it, or we can reduce it to that insofar. And also, we see the involved jurisdictions, the involved countries. insofar. So we see headquarter countries, we see operative countries or countries with operating companies, and we see countries, investment hubs very often with regard to in certain investment companies, so where intellectual property is located or certain finance activity is located and so on. So rather, let's say, specialized countries for this kind of business. And in a way, they belong all together, are covered by these multinationals, having companies in all these places. But also there's, of course, a kind of a competition, and there's also a kind of an impact of the current international tax system, the current international tax framework, insofar. Headquarter companies, and if we make it a little bit more complex, and I didn't want to start with this, but let's say with the principle, if we make it a little bit more complex, then we see in these, let's say, giant regions, there is the prime location for headquarters. And we see in these investment hubs, this is the prime location for these IP investment finance companies. And we see, let's say, the whole world where more or less operative activities take place. And the current tax system, of course, has a kind of a battle with regard, for instance, to the topic of allocation of taxing rights. And if you have a look on that, then of course you see, I mean, even post BEPS project, you see kind of profit shifting. You see kind of a substance shifting because BEPS requires substance. But what happened if you had, for instance, certain assets in an investment company? Let's take an intellectual property, and this was then given to operative companies. They pay royalties insofar, and of course these profits are then collected in companies in the investment hubs. And what happened then with the BEPS project? Well, there was a requirement of substance. So, but what was the case was there was, let's say, a kind of a profit shift to these investment hubs there, but after BEPS there was not a reshift, but there was in question even also a shift of substance. And of course, with this shift of substance and profits, there is also a kind of a shift of tax. And at the very end, we talk on the allocation of taxing rights as a prime topic. We talk on the topic of nexus, how can we levy taxes? And of course, we talk on tax competition, but tax competition is not something all countries are involved in the same way, but we see rather tax competition between headquarter countries, between investment companies, between operative companies, and maybe in a way a tax competition between headquarter companies and investment hub countries. So it's quite diversified also this perspective, and we should not have a look to say just in an overall picture the tax competition. I think it's a much more precise topic, and to see whom is with whom in a competitive situation. Not all are in the same competition field to say. So many can be said about that, but this is just my impression, and we can really go back to this picture in a way to make it more simple, and to see the trees and the forest, and not to mix up everything. Having said that, of course, we saw in the past these so-called race to the bottom. Corporate income tax rates came down, and you see here the different region. The Latin American countries is included all zero and low tax countries. So that's included in this OECD corporate data, and we see the trend. That's the message. It came rather down. We can talk about race to the bottom. We can also speak about more competitiveness, or the countries take less of economic activities. We can have a different perspective, but I think the picture is rather clear. So let's name it like a race to the bottom, to be a little bit maybe also provocative. What we also see is a race to the top, and some are more included than others, are obviously more successful, and others took the chance of this level playing field, took the chance of competition. It's always an opportunity, and it's always a challenge, and it depends on for whom it is an opportunity, for whom it is a challenge. And we see, for instance, Ireland, who has the corporate income tax revenue 4 times than it has about 20 years ago. So a clear signal of a very interesting position, taking advantage, of course, developing very well in so far, and the reduction of the corporate income tax burden, tax rate, having an advantageous tax framework is one of the drivers. There are potentially others, but here we focus on tax, so we can quite see in a kind of this empirical evidence there is some relevance of tax in so far. Switzerland, we see the Netherlands, not that dramatic, but in a way these are, let's say, positions of so-called investment hubs. This means competitive tax system, and also high numbers, we come back to that in a minute, high numbers of foreign direct investment inflows and outflows. So this is the characterization also by the UN regarding investment hubs. We then can go on a little bit, and in empirical studies we see the OECD takes care on that, but also other institutes, and insofar we see that about 70% of the profits of multinationals are booked and reported in high income jurisdictions and investment hubs. So rather in the ones where multinationals are located, in principle, in general, and where these investment companies are located. Okay, 70% of the profits of M&E are reported there. So this is a kind of, there's the profit, there might be also the substance, there might be also the revenue, the tax revenue. The second number is also interested to see that about 21% of the reported profits of the M&Es, the 750 million plus euro M&E, that they are reported in jurisdictions with an effective tax rate of either less than 5% or at least less than 15%. So rather in, let's say, competitive jurisdictions regarding the tax system, the effective tax rate. Going further, and then it becomes even more interesting, I think, is if we have a look of the low tax profits of these M&E. So these M&E obviously have low tax profits, and where are these reported in which jurisdictions? And the answer is 80% of the low tax profits are reported in high income jurisdictions and in investment hubs. Investment hubs, might not be so surprised, but we might be surprised that they are also booked in so far in high income countries. So also in high income countries, there must be the possibility of having low tax profits. Low is always below 15%. Last figure in so far, we see also that about 47% of these low tax M&E profits are reported in jurisdictions, again, with an effective tax rate below 5 or below 15%. Also, not surprising, of course, low tax profits are reported in, let's say, low tax jurisdiction, low below 15, not 0. Okay? But the opposite is maybe even more interesting. So 53% are reported in countries that have, in principle, a higher effective tax rate, above the 15%. But still, we talk about low tax profits. So this means that high tax countries, jurisdictions, they obviously offer also a kind of lower taxation than the 15%. for instance, with an IP box, with a box on intellectual property rights and the profits and the revenue out of that. So it's quite interesting to have these kind of data to get a little bit more into the picture. It's not the naming and shaming and blaming, but I think most important if we talk about the international tax framework and international tax competition is that we understand how it works, that we understand how the situation is before we start off thinking, well, what can be done in general on an international level and or what can be done on a country level, how a country should define its position and so on and so on. So I think that's at least for me quite interesting to have these numbers. We had the BEPS project. Yes, very old, these slides. We run around for 10 years or 10 years plus with it. Still, you see the red parts means the minimum standard. Everything else is in a way still on hold or in progress or in process, however you call it. So there are many more topics that could be addressed that are part of BEPS, anti-base erosion profit shifting methods, but we stick with harmful tax practices to be abolished. The Forum on Harmful Tax Practices takes care also regarding substance. So today you might say, well, we have a kind of BEPS with substance, and also the prevention of a misuse of double tax treaties. Besides transfer pricing, reporting, CPC, country-by-country reporting, in some countries now even public and dispute resolution topics, but many more to be discussed. And of course, also on the floor, taxation of the digital economy. And this became then a part of the two pillars, to say pillar 2 especially, and pillar 1 still on hold. So having the picture in so far where we are, well, we have side by side also a development regarding exchange of information, and this went very far even before the BEPS process. Exchange of information upon request, exchange of information in an automatic way, and also country by country reporting is a kind of exchange of information. We see new developments taking into consideration crypto assets and much more and so on. And on the bottom you see the Forum Harmful Tax Competition. And insofar, we more or less have a focus just on so-called non or low tax jurisdictions. They are currently in the focus if they cannot show up with substance. Forum on Harmful Tax Practices is the precise name. Also on the European Union level, don't want to bore you too much with that, we see a kind of bringing countries, jurisdictions, let's say, in line with their idea of having a tax good governance, let's say a positive tax framework with an kind of an fair competition. And also this is linked to exchange of information, OECD-wise, and also this is linked to the BEPS process and could be linked, that's a discussion, also with the pillars, especially pillar 1, the global minimum tax. And you see different kind of listings. So the Annex 2 listings, this is kind of non-cooperative jurisdictions, but they promised to take care on these requirements by the European Code of Conduct Group. And the Annex 1 are jurisdictions that do not promise and they do not take care on these requirements, and therefore they're listed insofar. And number 3 is there are defense measures by EU member states, more or one of these defense measures or more than one of these defense measures. There are member states that include all 4 possibilities, 3-4 possibilities. There are others, they just include some. The idea is countries and companies cannot have the same market access in the EU, for instance, if they are listed jurisdictions. So they are countermeasures, defense measures insofar. That's the idea. And here you see the criteria. We don't have to go more into detail in so far. Then quite interesting, and in this debate, still, that's what is the topic, the international tax framework and impact on international tax competition, where we are. And there's an interesting study also, as mentioned at the beginning, by NGOs, and one of is Tax Justice Network, also to take that into consideration, with a certain position to be discussed, of course. And their tax justice network corporate tax haven index is quite also interesting to get a little bit more into the picture. Whether we share that view or not is a further question. And of course, as mentioned, this can be discussed quite intensively. But first of all, it's quite interesting to see how they, let's say, evaluate the world. They have two perspectives. So, and you see it on the x-axis, they have two perspectives. This is a so-called tax haven index. So they regard all countries, jurisdictions of the world, most of it, some are missing, some are not included. They do an analysis by 18 criteria, whether they are regarded and how strongly they are regarded as a tax haven. And the perspective is, in a way, every country might be a tax haven. So it's not the classical ones you may have in mind, but they look with these criteria to any country, including G7, including OECD, G20, of course, the classical ones you may think about, and so on and so on. And they make a kind of a haven score for all of them. And of course, we can heavily discuss on that, whether the right criteria are chosen and whether with regard to this different criteria, this is being seen correctly. Everything is in a way very transparent. You can have a look on the homepage and can see which country, which jurisdictions is identified with regard to the respective criteria. So quite interesting. We don't share all the assessment they made. Some is correct, some need some improvement, but let's say that's a more detailed discussion. On the other axle, we see the so-called global scale weight. So let's say the importance to globalization, we could say so, with regard to the criteria, which is the sum of inward and outward foreign direct investment. So take the picture again, and therefore we have it all the time here. On the top right, you see multinationals, you see investment companies in investment hubs, and of course there might be a foreign direct investment in such an investment company, investment hub, and inward and also outward to a country where they have an operative company. So this is just an inward investment and an outward investment. And we see, and these are the red circles, the red bubbles, we see that all these countries and jurisdictions, they are investment hubs. So they are classified by the UN as investment hubs, and the World Bank as investment hubs. The blue ones, they are classified, however their position is, as high income countries. And we see one, I think it's South Africa, high middle income country. So we have these two dimensions. And what we see is that, for instance, let's take the Netherlands, not to blame, but to understand. Let's take the Netherlands. They have a haven score of 74. And you see the Netherlands is not on the top, to say so. Where is it? Here. So it's not a 100. 100 would be, let's say, full haven. It's 74. So competitive, but not super competitive, to name it like this. But they play an enormous role with regard to the scale world, to the global scale world, with regard to the sum of inward and outward investment. So the assumption is, it's not a proof, but the assumption is that for instance, many holding companies taking being an investment of a foreign headquarter, investing in other countries are done through the Netherlands. Okay, and we see, and this is then quite impressive, if you have also the figures of the other countries and jurisdictions, we see that 11% of the global foreign direct investments go via the Netherlands. And 11% is really a high number insofar, and therefore, with a then complex formula, of course, we can also go into the details and analyze it and criticize it and so on. That's not the topic today. We see that at the very end, we see the Netherlands ranked in these tax justice tax haven index, the global tax havenry, as it is called, as the number 7. Okay, number 1 is the BVI, and then number 7, for instance, is the Netherlands. Quite important. We see other important players, Singapore, for instance, Ireland, already mentioned before, Luxembourg, Hong Kong, and so on. So quite interesting to see what's in a way real there. We have to take into consideration, again, this is a more, I call it maybe a little subjective analysis. Can't be that objective. Maybe there are some mistakes. Why these 18 criteria, not other criteria, and so on and so on. And this is more objective data, the sum of the inward and outward investments or direct investments. Another, how to say, picture to get more involved in how is the situation, because we try to understand it not only by this is the standard and there's another standard and there's another standard, but how is the real outcome. Well, one of the to say so answers of these kind of empirical data, but we can assume, or we can see, because this is a 2024 update, that this is already with BEPS, with the BEPS project as it is, and it is in a way including whatever is left, maybe a lot, base erosion, profit shifting with substance, because it is a post-BEPS analysis. Well, another post-BEPS 1.0 topic is, of course, the introduction of the global minimum taxation. We will come in the panel later on in detail to that. So just to mention it, not that you think, well, but he forgot the global minimum tax. And this is kind of a basic principle or basic example. We see a parent company, effective tax rate 25%, so no issue under the global minimum tax. We see limited subsidiaries in country B. One is clearly below 15, the other one is about 25%, so clear above the 15%. Altogether, with the jurisdictional blending, you can mix them. They are still at 15%. Therefore, there's no need in a way to apply the global minimum tax. And we see the subsidiary number C, which has an effective tax rate of 10%, maybe using an IP box, a tax incentive, or the tax rate there is about 10%. Let's assume it. It's enough substance there according to BEPS 1.0, therefore not further challenged. But it is below the 15%. And how does GLOBE work? Well, it could be the law of country C, including and introducing a qualified domestic minimum top-up tax. So the difference between 10 and 15%, the 5% top-up tax will be levied by country C. Or if this is not the case, it will be levied by country A if they introduced global minimum tax. If both did not introduce the global minimum tax, that's the idea. Then the last backstop mechanism comes into play, and this is country C, that they apply under tax profits rule, means that the profits of company C, which are under tax, the 100, the tax rate is 5, will then be levied in country B. So in a way to make it waterproof, that we apply the global minimum tax. That's the idea. As mentioned, we come later on to the discussion. But of course, please interrupt me all the time. I forgot to say that. Please, whenever you have a question or remark, just go ahead, please.
Compare this discussion. What would be the solution if we have a diverse scenario when two or three countries adopt the minimum tax Colombia has versus two or three countries that don't have it, and the two or three countries that don't have it are the parent company. What would be the solution for that?
Yeah, well, the idea is if any of the involved countries with companies, if there is at least one that the global minimum tax framework is applying. So let's assume the parent does not apply it, but the subsidiary already does apply it with the minimum tax, it's done. They don't do it, the parent doesn't do it, then these other subsidiary countries can do it. So that's the kind of a backstop mechanism. Of course, if there are just three or there are three countries involved which all do not implement the global minimum tax, then of course there is no global minimum tax. But that's the idea is that you need just one country. So in a way, the idea was, well, multinationals usually are in many countries. And if a critical number of these countries involve the globe system, there's enough pressure on all the others also to introduce the global minimum tax. Because otherwise, I mean, the subsidiary in country C, that's the focus here in that example. If any other company is located in a globe implementing country, then the C Limited and country C cannot offer, let's say, this 10% preferential rate anymore because it's taxed somewhere else. And with this pressure, the idea is then that for instance, country C will introduce a global qualified domestic minimum top-up tax in order to tax the profits itself, because knowing that they will be taxed. And with that scenario, country C might think about, well, if the profits of my companies will be taxed anyway at 15%, I can do it myself. Or even vice versa, in a way of, I want to do it myself because it's my profit, so-called.
Just a
Please.
comment. I think the question also, since we were using the example of Colombia, I guess the question was more what's happening if I have a country that is implementing a QMTT, and that's the only rule that's implemented. In that scenario, I don't see how I can take the income that is allocated to the parent company towards the country that is implementing the QMTT, because this QMTT will only apply to those companies that are resident within the country that is applying this rule, not like the UTPR or the IR that might take the income of the companies that are not resident within their jurisdiction. So in the case of Colombia, we can now basically take the parent company and make them pay taxes here.
Exactly. I mean, the parent company will not be, yeah.
No, my question was with the US,
Mm-hmm.
because the US, I think it's fair to say that they are not going to do this, never. So what happens then?
Exactly. Well, the US and the side-by-side agreement, as we know it today, more an announcement and an agreement with the G7 on a very general way. The details have to be figured out, and I think we're exactly in this process currently. I have two examples for the later discussion to show which could be the outcome exactly what you mentioned. Being on the one hand side excluded, so not implementing GLOBE, but on the other side also not being affected by GLOBE. So in a way, very briefly, that's the idea of the side-by-side agreement. In a way that the US have a system, or maybe others have a system that is kind of being regarded. Let's be diplomatic, of being regarded equivalent. And the question is, how equivalent is the US system, the old one, the new one? How equivalent is it to the globe rules? And therefore, how far-reaching is this? We don't know, side-by-side agreement, or will be. I think with that regard, I wouldn't be surprised to say so if we end up with a side-by-side agreement that in a way clearly mentions that the US or a similar system with review and what have you, but that kind of system is regarded as being entirely equivalent. I would be surprised if anybody is surprised about that result. That would be my the only thing I would be surprised about. But I don't know, and we don't know. But I think it's more than looking into the crystal ball. And this is a special situation. And then, of course, we can continue. What if this would be the outcome? What might be the future position of China and of other large players? Therefore, I mentioned them at the beginning. But I think that's a very, very interesting topic also for the panel we have in so far. We can go into more detail in so far if that is fine. Okay. Where do we end up? Oh, sorry, please.
What is the benefit for a foreign company? That is a stereotype because it's based on transparency among the stakeholders. I think in the survey companies that work between Colombia and England versus Island Union is 0. It's idealistic. What we a whole country with that idea? Because I think this idea is for a rich countries. Is that me?
I fully understand your point. Well, it's an idea to say so, to address a certain topic, to address a certain issue, to address a certain problem. Let's call it like that. And I would just go back to this kind of a complex picture. Yeah. And I think what we see as a result of how to say, everything, the economic situation, the political situation, tax competition, international tax standards, even after BEPS, base erosion profit shifting, to be addressed especially also by substance. So you need substance to have a certain low, zero preferential taxation. The nexus approach for intellectual property, IP boxes, is one of it. Okay, you cannot just offer a preferential taxation for royalties, income out of intellectual property in an IP box. What you need is substance. You need research, development, all these kinds, which is linked to substance. But of course, we are still in this world, and we are still in this world of, let's say, different players, different countries with different regulatory setup, with different political setup, with different whatever setup. And obviously, these lead to this kind of situation that some countries are not happy with the situation that there is, let's say, economic activity, but the profits are reported and realized somewhere else. But this is in a way also the result of a pure contract. If you give a loan and you receive interest, of course, it is the bank who receives the interest. The other one has to pay. The question is, where can it be taxed? So this is the topic of allocation of taxing rights. It's a topic of nexus. What should be the nexus? And in this world, in this world also analyzed by Tax Justice Network, and one of the criteria is double tax treaty aggressiveness. And double tax treaty aggressiveness is something like if you force your partner to reduce the withholding tax on royalties, dividends, interest payments to zero. Because then they have no stake in that. Let's leave out dividends, that's maybe very complex, but in royalties and in interest payment, it's quite clear. If the withholding tax, and you can talk about, okay, it's a tax on cross payment, but it's not on profits, many details. But in the very end, if you with a zero withholding tax in a double tax treaty, OECD style, then of course the source country, let's name it like that, they have no taxing right anymore if they sign this treaty. And this is the topic. So profits go to, from many operating companies, countries, go to other countries. Rather, the more developed, not to say super developed, or the giant countries. Okay? So that's one thing. So there's a kind of profit shifting, or at least the profits are reported there. And with this zero taxation in the source, also the tax is there levied. And mechanism then, how to say, requirements were introduced, BEPS, to say, well, but here, if you offer an IP box, you need substance. If you need substance here, the question is, can you show up the substance? And what we see is that the empirical data, we talked about it, it shows us that it's not in a way that the profits are, let's say, shifted back. If we have a look on the data regarding tax revenue, it's not a change in the situation. It's a continuing situation that more and more revenue is levied in these parts, in these countries. So what we see, and this is in a way maybe my hypothesis, but what we see is a profit shifting, or at least a profit reporting subject to substance requirements. And we see substance shifting, not a reshifting of the profits, but you shift also then the substance, because there you need then substance. These are very highly developed countries. So of course there is a lot of development. And with that, you have the tax shifting. So, and what is the idea of the global minimum tax then coming back is that at least you cannot go below this certain threshold of 15%. So that may be probably the idea that let's say the focus is not so much anymore, and the benefit is not so much anymore to shift and to profit, to have the profits in these kind of jurisdictions. That's the idea. Whether you are a rich or a poor or a middle or whatever country. Okay? And I mean, this is again a part of the panel, but just in frank to answer the question. I mean, if you're a country and you see you might be here or wherever, and your rate and your burden is above 25%, and you are sure about it, you cannot have a problem. Interestingly, we see implementation of a QDMTT in Brazil, which is regarded as a high tax country. We see introduction of a QDMTT in many EU countries, which is an option besides the directive. It's not needed, but it's an option, but they do it. So in a way, they don't trust either their own tax system, that they are all the time above the 15%, or they also offer tax incentives, and they are also a part of this game. As I mentioned, low tax profits of M&Es, of multinationals, are also heavily reported in high tax jurisdictions. So they must offer something which is not so high taxed. So the world is not, here are the good and there are the bad ones. Yeah? And we don't talk in a way like investment hubs is the bad ones. No, they are part of the game. But there are other countries here which are also super attractive.
Maybe I think it's a dilemma imprisionero. Que todos cooperen porque todos van a ganar. Digamos el antecesor del equilibrio de Nash. Se parte acá porque todos los actores van a cooperar.
That you're saying that there's the dilemma of the prisoner, which takes into account that everyone's gonna cooperate.
Ok, si alguno de los actores
If any of the
defecciona, es decir, traiciona al otro,
doesn't cooperate like it was expected,
ambos pierden.
both are gonna lose.
Esa fue la base de la teoría de Nash, el equilibrio de Nash con la cual se ganó premio Nobel de Economía.
That's the base of the theory of Nash, which was about pricing.
Yeah,
En el otro lado, los sistemas democráticos se plantea que los actores actúan de manera desinteresadas para un ganar-ganar.
Under the democratic system, players they act in an individualistic way. So everyone's trying to win-win.
Se puede plantear que la debilidad de esta teoría,
so the weakness of this theory is
que los individuos y los estados buscarán maximizar sus recursos.
The individuals and governments are going to try to maximize their resources.
Y el caso concreto son los países, por ejemplo, como Inglaterra,
Such as England,
que tienen jurisdicciones no cooperantes o de baja tributación,
which has some jurisdiction that are not cooperative or with the law,
Islas Británicas, Islas Vírgenes, etcétera,
like all the islands.
de donde salen los impuestos, las utilidades de los países de la fuente no desarrollados.
Where all
Colombia es un país de la fuente no desarrollado o pobre, ya es en desarrollo para nuestro país.
where the jurisdiction that are source states such as Colombia
Utilizan los CEDEL para enviarlos a Inglaterra y luego bajarlos a sus jurisdicciones
is
no
about
cooperantes.
20% goes to the UK and then take it back to the island to have to tax rate or maybe with them.
Esa, digamos, es como el análisis que planteo hace ahorita. Debería que por eso lo llamo idealista.
So that's all to say that this is an idealistic theory, something close to that was a bit my
Yeah. No, I fully understand it.
That question, real world, that doesn't play out because you have important players like the US that are saying, no, I'm not going to play because I don't want to. And a decision from just the US has effects. Effects in there are practitioners saying that the euro is going to back down on this kind of thing. So in practice, some cooperate and some not. And this one behind it, I'm so very hard.
But the United States is the neocons. Bush, Trump were neocons, neoconservadores. They say that the United States is the boss, and they do that they want. They say that the Nations Unidas International is only a place to talk. That's it. Robert Kagan. Any networking say that most people going on remember so.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the let's say very comprehensive question comment. I try to make some comments to it. Well, you summed up it in a way as a comprehensive view, to say so. And how to say, I want to start with something in my answer or my remarks, which I didn't expect to do, to protect the US. The US were, like in other topics, were the ones who addressed this topic first with their guilty system some time ago. because the US also saw this development and they saw it from a different perspective. Have a look again insofar. They saw it from a headquarter perspective, and they saw that profits have been shifted, for instance, to Ireland, substance has been shifted to Ireland, tax has been shifted to Ireland. Especially assets have been shifted to Ireland with regard to intellectual property, has something to do with these kind of products and so on and so on. So their idea was, well, let's have a more favorable system insofar in a way to bring these topics back home. The problem is that in a way, not only these kind of profits and assets have been shifted, but afterwards also tangibles and more substance is shifted. So, and you mentioned Nash and so on, and also the OECD, if we then have a look on a solution, which is the pillar 2 or a idea of a solution, it's not more, and you say, well, it's a kind of an idealistic idea. The OECD says, well, the introduction of this pillar 2 with the global minimum tax has a negative impact on global GDP. Wow, you can say, what's that? Why do we do it? Well, of course, because the companies, the multinationals, all in all, at the sum, not which country has more in the pocket, but all in all, they might pay more taxes. And of course, if they pay more taxes, there's a negative impact on economic growth. If we delete corporate income tax, there will be maybe a kind of a boost of the economy. Because we don't eat up the company profits, they can invest more, something like that, we can discuss it. Okay, so that's one thing. The next thing is how to organize it, idealistic, but as pragmatic as possible, as safe, as waterproof as possible. Let's introduce a system you cannot go out, you cannot come out, even not in the mentioned islands or wherever. Low tax jurisdictions, zero tax jurisdictions. The idea is there is no place to hide, to say so, to be untaxed. That's the idea. And the more they come into the play and the more they implement it, the less there's a possibility that you have a multinational group that is not affected by GLOBE, because not one single subsidiary is in a GLOBE implemented country. That's the idea. Let's leave out the US for a second and let's assume they have an equivalent system. Okay, good. Having said that, we will have this kind of 15% minimum. But then we come to the details and we see what is the aim of the global minimum taxation. The aim is to floor tax competition. The aim is not to rule out tax competition. Otherwise, the rules should look different, should have been designed different. The aim is to prevent base erosion profit shifting, but not entirely to rule it out. So in a way, you see rules which are a compromise and so on, a common standard. Many countries, jurisdictions have said, yes, that's a good idea to say so, have approved it. And you see that, of course, this is not a puristic system. So it has, let's say, certain elements to limit, to floor tax competition. And it has also certain elements where you say, well, but this is not so much limiting tax competition. If we have a more in-depth view about it, maybe it even boosts tax competition. That's a point I address, for instance, in certain circumstances, you might have even a boost of tax competition by introducing a minimum tax. And my hypothesis then, it's more maybe a maximum tax than a minimum tax. But again, we can discuss that in the panel discussion. But again, none of these systems are, let's say, ideal. None of these systems are totally waterproof, and so on and so on. The question remains: what is the stake in it? I mean, if your tax burden of all your companies, of all the companies in whichever country you are, so to speak, you can be country A, or you can be country C or country B. If your tax burden of at least all the companies that belong to a multinational group, like in country B, so some use an incentive and the others don't. If this is your country, you have all in all at least 15%. You don't need to implement the global minimum. Yeah? Nobody will tax your profits. If you are country C, you are at risk that your profits, to say so, are taxed by somebody else, by another country. If you want to prevent it, you have to include GLOBE, you have to introduce a QDMTT, Qualified Domestic Minimum Top-Up Tax, or you have to raise your general tax burden. You can also say my tax rate is 15% and the tax base is similar to that of the global minimum system. So my tax is 15%, nobody else will tax it. Okay, so that's a different perspectives you can have. If you want to be competitive in some sectors, having tax incentives, but have a high corporate income tax per se, then it's a more sophisticated position. And you must think more carefully how you can organize it. Okay. Good. With all that, ending up where we are today in a kind of, we could think about four clustering kind of corporate income taxation. So we might have the ordinary one. This is according to national tax codes with a tax burden below or above or exactly at 15%. Something like that most countries' jurisdictions have. If you introduce the global minimum tax, then you have another additional tax system in your country for these multinationals that have that fulfill a certain threshold, that are internationally organized and so on and so on. The 750 million turnover as a minimum. So you have at least 15%. Okay. You might end up also saying, well, at least we have some charitable entities, charitable foundations, whatever you think about, you want to exempt them. Well, you can do if they are active. Then they need kind of substance as an exemption from the ordinary tax system, or they should not have any kind of economic activities. You see it around the world, in Europe, in Asia, for instance, family offices are very similar organized, and then it's usually organized as an asset structure. What I want to say is we have quite a diversified picture of the corporate income tax system. It's not the one and only, and now there's even GLOBE, but it's even more with regard to exemptions for asset structures, family offices, and also with regard to charitable entities, not to forget them in the whole picture. And of course, on the left hand, you are in the pure economic activity, and on the right hand side, you are rather in the more administrative activity, if at all, or you need kind of substance. So we are quite in a really complex situation, not having the corporate income tax and the GLOBE. It's even more complex. That's the idea of showing it up. I think I skipped the topic with regard to individuals. Maybe we can address that, just one topic at the very end. Of course, not of course, but individuals are also currently, as mentioned at the beginning, coming more and more in the focus of this international tax framework, international tax standards. And there is this idea either of a global minimum wealth tax, a good or a bad idea. You can discuss at length, and even is it a wealth tax or rather forms of income taxation. And also the OECD, the G20, took care in so far and address it in a way of, well, balancing out sovereignty of jurisdictions on the one hand side, and the kind of taxation of high net worth individuals being effectively taxed on the other. I was addressed to speak a little bit also about Liechtenstein in this process of tax standards and so on. I try to make it short. This is a picture just with the Liechtenstein flag in the center. You will see in a minute. We can do it also for Colombia, because the tax framework is more or less the same, subject to certain European topics. In Liechtenstein, if you have a look on let's say what is the core for the Liechtenstein tax Tax Act, and this was a part of the Liechtenstein Tax Reform 2010, came into force 2011. You see that certain topics have been addressed, and I want to focus on two or three. First is it has to be in conformity with European law as a European economic area member state, not EU, but closely linked to the internal market, same principles, and also with international compatibility that has to be safeguarded. So two principles as a small country that has to follow the rules of the others, of the international community, because Liechtenstein is, as mentioned, super small and will not convince others about their standards, but vice versa. Liechtenstein, like Singapore and others, is a follower, is a price taker. Others determine the rules Liechtenstein has to follow in order to safeguard the market accessibility for Liechtenstein companies in a small country. Your export quota, and that's the same in Liechtenstein for services, but also for industrial products, is about 100%. So you really depend on foreign markets and therefore have to fulfill that. The outcome was and that's maybe interesting, a further development of the taxation of individuals, which has a kind of a presumptive income tax part. So just to mention, it's not if there are dividends, you tax it, and if there are no dividends, you don't tax it. But you take the wealth in the hand of the shareholders, and 4% out of that wealth of the shareholders, the net wealth, is the presumed income out of the wealth, whether you have dividends or not. Okay, and this is a very effective way of taxation, and is even one proposed with the global minimum wealth tax being as one option to safeguard the taxation of individuals, also of ultra high net worth individuals. And if you have a look on the corporate picture, then Liechtenstein is presenting today exactly like this. There's the corporate income tax. Yes, it's that's 12.5%. Sorry for that. That's 12.5%. So quite attractive, but there's also the introduction of the global minimum tax, and there are exemptions for kind of asset structures, and also especially for charitable foundations that are not taxed, not to tax the activities of charitable foundations in so far. And so that's the tax system in a way of Liechtenstein. And what is maybe the interesting thing is that the tax strategy was in the 2008, 9, 10 years entirely shifted. So from one to the other, Liechtenstein was a country with a strong banking secrecy, still the case, but not for taxes anymore. This has gone with the Global Forum at the beginning, 2009, being a part of the automatic exchange of information and so on, being well peer-reviewed by OECD, Inclusive Framework, Global Forum, and so on and so on. So being a part of this world, of being in conformity with international tax standards. But it had to be very heavily shifted. And it was a process that took place rather in a short-term period of time than in a lengthy period of time, because it was clear the business model of the past will not be the one of the future. So one has to adapt, and if so, do it quick. As a small country, you have no resources, there's no market you can wait for. If, let's say, the business model story, to say so, is gone, it's gone. So you have to adapt, and you have to adapt quickly. That was the idea, and with that, it was a successful idea. But of course, many had to adapt. Vice versa, it was in favor, to say so, of the industry, because what happened? This slide was empty 15 years ago. So there were more or less no double tax treaties with other countries and so on. And this is all what happened in the 15 years. So you see the entire shift, having double tax treaties, having full exchange of information, being in the peer review process, applying FATCA, applying automatic exchange of information with crypto assets, with whatever is on the agenda, introducing Pillar 2, we are with that development. Whether we like it or not, we are too small to say we don't like it. We cannot afford that. Yeah, we have to comply. This is the strategy. We have to fully comply because we need market access. We are dependent on the rules of the others. We apply the rules of the others and not vice versa. So, and that's a question, of course, I'm not the person to speak about. How does this affect the situation, for instance, of Colombia? And how can Colombia do what it has already done? I mean, you introduced a minimum tax already years ago in a similar way to floor the effect of certain tax incentives within the country, not on the cross-border perspective, but within the country. So some of the ideas of a minimum taxation, you can say, have also their source in Colombia. But the question, of course, is how to address all these international developments and where's the impact, for instance, for Colombia again. Of course, I have neither the authority nor the capacity to make any proposals. I can address that in a discussion or so, or what I would think, what might be an idea, and so far. But I have maybe one perspective, and the one perspective is that there is no one-fits-all strategy. So what is good for the US or for Liechtenstein, I mean, this is the most different you can maybe compare, is not good for Colombia or for Germany or for France or for Singapore or for China. So you need to develop your own strategy in your own business environment, in the own situation with the own goals and so on and so on. What I think is very interesting, and this is just one little piece of a puzzle. What I think is very interesting is if I see and it's my second time in Colombia, so don't misunderstand. I'm the opposite of knowing something. What I see is okay. Told is, well, there's a very interesting IT AI community in Colombia being developing. And I think that's very interesting. I mean, have a look what is on this world. That's IT and AI. And if you're a part of it, wow, that's encouraging. And that might be a point to address, to think about, because we see, I mean, all of these super players, the Metas, the Googles, and the Microsofts, and all of them. Decades ago, years ago, we didn't know. How's it called? Facebook? Never heard. Meta? Never heard. It's not such a long time ago. And so I think that's very encouraging, and that would be my statement in so far. And after, I think, the break, we will continue with the panel on the global minimum tax, so we can have a more close look in so far. For now, thank you very much for your audience, and I'm very happy to continue discussion within the break, during the panel, after the panel, whenever. It's really lovely to be here, and of course, the more we can discuss on all these topics, the more happy I am. Thank you very much for your audience. Thank you. And if I may allow it, I usually do this. I want to do a picture vice versa. So and maybe you can do one including myself. That's even better. Yep, there you go. Wonderful. Thank you. So with that, I give back to Dr. Yono Yeda. I think you have the organization and how we continue. Please.
Thank you, for Professor Martin. Now we're going to have a break of 12 minutes. So we're going to be back here at 10:40. Okay? To continue with the panel.
Good. Yeah, all fine.
section, we're going to have Zulay Arevalo, who is a lawyer from the Universidad External of Colombia with a specialization in tax law from the same university and an advanced LLM in international taxation from Leiden University. She was part of the Latin American Business Center at EY New York, and currently Zulay is a senior manager at EY Colombia. Then we also have Oscar Muneva, who is a lawyer from the Universidad External of Colombia with a specialization in tax law from the same university, from the Universidad de los Andes, and an advanced LLM in international taxation from Leiden University. He is currently a senior associate at Martinez. And finally, we have the participation of Maite Martinez Escribano Serrano, who is a research and teaching assistant in the area of tax law at the University Autónoma de Madrid. She is also a lawyer with experience in tax advising, and she is also a PhD candidate. Her thesis is on the analysis of tax competition phenomenon in the context of Pillar 2 global minimum tax. And finally, we have Professor Dr. Martin Benz, who I introduced this morning earlier. And we're gonna have my participation, who I am a professor of this university, a tax lawyer, and most of you might know me from the aulas from this university. So welcome, Professor, welcome, Zulay, welcome, Oscar and Maite are gonna be with us online. However, they are gonna hear all your questions. However, if you have any question before you speak, just let us know. We give you the micro, and like this, they can hear those questions and they can answer and intervene and also be part of the discussion. Since this is gonna be a panel, the idea is that we make it as interactive as possible. Okay. Thank you so much, and well, the floor is all yours. Before we start with the panel, sorry. This shows that we're lawyers. Okay, the floor is all yours. Before we start with the panel, Professor Martin will do an introductory presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Yuno Ida, for your introduction of the panel, also in the morning, where we had our first session on challenges and opportunities in international taxation, the international tax framework, and tax competition. And one important topic. Maybe we can have the slides again.
Oh, yeah.
Just continue. I put it all in one. Is of course the global minimum taxation the whole world is talking about, and I don't know what we would do in academia if we wouldn't have this topic. Probably we would have other topics, but as we have this one, we heavily contribute to it, and it's a part of it became a part of our life. So we are full in the global minimum tax, whether it makes sense or not, as it was already challenged before. Yeah, with this kind of basic example, I simplified before. We see what is the global minimum tax about. Leave out all the lametta, all the things around, and just focus on the four companies in three countries here. So company A at the top. The effective tax rate is 25%, so there's no need for a minimum taxation. The same with both companies in country B, together blended, so mixed. They have a tax, they raise a tax burden or levy a tax burden of 15%. So also no problem, no need to say so for a global minimum taxation if you want to apply it. But country C and company C in country C is the issue, is the target. The tax burden, tax rate is 10%. So an additional top-up tax, that it is called additional 5%, should be levied according to the idea, to the principles and to the rules of the global minimum tax. How? Well, the first stake insofar has country C by introducing a domestic minimum top-up tax, this DMTT, and if it is regarded a qualified one, means in accordance, in conformity with the globe rules, then it is regarded a QDMTT. So country C can solve the problem. It could have been solved the problem even before by national tax laws. Now it does it potentially by a Globe Act. If country C is doing nothing or is not doing this, then country A, company A, comes into play in a way that the parent can levy these 5% on the profits of the C Limited. With this IIR, with this income inclusion rule. So that's the rule order. And if both don't do it, neither country C nor A, then country B can do it with the so-called under-tax profits rules. So in country B, these under-tax profits might be taxed. So that's the idea of the global minimum taxation in a nutshell in this example, but just that it reminds us. Then to give a very brief overview in this keynote about the global implementation, we have this map and try to be to have it on a day-by-day basis. You see 2nd of September is the last update. And we try to classify what countries are doing, jurisdictions. Do they introduce the globe per se or rules? Do they go even further, like European Union member states? So they don't introduce only the global minimum taxation regarding multinationals, but also regarding large-scale domestic groups. This has something to do with European Union principles, not to discriminate foreign companies. So you also have to bring in a large-scale domestic group of your own country, even if they have no cross-border situation, so not to discriminate foreign ones. Therefore, the European Union member states usually have a kind of an all-in plus, as we call it. So the all-in is then what countries' jurisdiction do if they, in principle, introduce the globe rules, and all-in minus if they introduce the globe rules, but with a little bit less content. So, for instance, no under-tax payments rule and or no QDMTT or something like that. But in principle, still follow the globe rules. For instance, the UK is an example, or Switzerland is an example. Insofar. Then you have countries, we call it maybe. So you see some elements or some ideas insofar. Colombia could be regarded as a maybe country. Why? Because you have a domestic minimum top-up tax, but it is not one that has a perspective of a globe domestic minimum top-up tax, and therefore a current stage it has no qualification status. But it was never the aim of being a QDMTT, so it's not surprising insofar. Then we have also the on-hold countries, in a way of we are waiting if they have any comment, implementing, not implementing. So they are on hold. China, for instance, India, to name two big players. And we have rather a neutral minus, to be diplomatic. For instance, the US. And as we know, they gave the idea of a global minimum tax because they had the idea and already introduced it when they started with their GILTI system. But they don't want to become a part of the globe system. And this reminds me to the times when we talked on automatic exchange of information. The US had the idea of FATCA, an automatic exchange of information, of banking information to the US regarding US taxpayers, resident individuals especially, and the whole world introduced afterwards automatic exchange of information, but on the common reporting standard, the US did not implement, and so we have a similar, in a way, a similar situation if you be not too much, if you don't go too much into the details. So you see a kind of a world where these rules are implemented. Some do it, some overdo it, some do less, and some think about it. So that's the level playing field we talked about before, level playing field on taxation. It's dynamic, it's fragmented, it's whatever you want. It's a very complex and interactive play. And of course, this is, if you put it negative, maybe frustrating or challenging or whatever. But on the other side, we can also say, hey, wow, this is super interesting, and to know more about is really a fascinating topic. And so many, more or less, every jurisdiction countries are involved. If we just have a 1 minute perspective or view, how you can implement these standards, and these standards are quite complex with tons of rules, to say so, hundreds of pages, rather on the way to 1,000 or maybe even more, then you have two opportunities, or maybe three. Doing nothing, of course, then it's done. That's not much work. Second, you can do it in a way of that you have a law, a new tax code with a huge reference to the globe rules, a huge reference to the globe rules. Positive, you are always on the state of play. Whatever the rules do, you have introduced the latest version. Negative, if you think on a legal perspective as lawyers, then of course this is a dynamic reference, even if you don't call it like that, and probably as a legislator you would not write it into the details, this is a dynamic reference, but what else is it if not a dynamic reference? Third approach, and it's quite interesting which countries are doing it. Some you think, oh yeah, I expected that, but some are different. You can do it in a very comprehensive way. So you take the globe rules and take them and write an act where you more or less write the same in your own act. Very complicated, and be careful that you still address the globe rules and not have a rule that is not fully in line with the globe rules. Okay, so quite, how to say, challenging, I would say, but many do, especially in the European Union, but also if we have a look on Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, quite detailed, being surprised, and this is quite a tough work, and you also have to develop that, because if the globe rules, let's say, amend, develop, whatever, then to be in line, if you want to do so, and probably you want, then you have to amend your legislation. So these are the different opportunities, 2 or 3, regarding implementation. Then some messages, and I want to forget the details. I want to give some prime messages. The message is this global minimum taxation is a full tax system. And it works as a benchmark system. If you don't comply with it, then there's a top-up tax, there's an additional tax. That's the idea. But the globe system is a full tax system. So it has a tax system, it's a worldwide tax system, not territorial, as in many countries, jurisdictions we see. Second, it has a defined tax base. On the left hand, you see a very brief version of it. At the very end, you have a tax base and you have a tax rate that's a 15%. So it has everything a tax system has, and it works as a benchmark. Okay. Second, and we have rule orders and what else? Just what we talked about, the QDMTT first, and then the IIR, and then the UTPR. That's rule order. And what is first if a country has a controlled foreign companies regime? Well, QDMTT first. So there's a lot of that inside. Then impact on tax systems. Well, it depends on a territorial system. Of course, if you don't tax foreign profits, to say so very briefly, the benchmark says, well, worldwide taxation, your taxation is 0 on foreign profits. If you're territorial, then there's an additional 15% on foreign profits. So territorial tax system are in a way canceled out by the global rules if they apply, if the companies are in scope. Competitive tax system, they have certain features to be more competitive. In case you are below the 15 of the benchmark system, ruled out. And the same with certain tax incentives and so on, depends how they are addressed by GLOBE, but they might also be canceled out, at least some, and this is a more detailed discussion we have. So you may have a tax system, 50% in general, but then you have incentives or this and that, you come down. What does the GLOBE system do? It brings you up and back to the 15%. And this is the idea of flooring tax competition, the very general idea of flooring tax competition. We can, of course, discuss the details. On the other side, you may also think, yeah, but what happens with high tax countries? They are above the 15%, a little bit or quite more than a little bit above the 15%, 20%, 25, 35%. I mean, Colombia, Brazil, other countries, Argentina, and so on. What can happen? Well, there might be room. You remember the B country, there's might be room for blending. So having companies with 25, 35%, but also having companies with less than 50%, 15%, 10%, 5% whatsoever, you can blend it. And of course, you can do it only if you are above the threshold of 15%. That could even boost tax competition, because you may think about, as a high tax country, well, why not introducing an IP box with 10% tax rate in addition as an incentive to our ordinary tax system. Having said that, just to illustrate it, you see Ireland, they are rather with 12.5% on the way to go to the top 15. And you could think about Colombia, that could mix with an ordinary tax rate of 35%, and then tax incentive with 10%, an IP box, whatever, and you can blend it down to 15%. In a way that you have 80% of preferred profits, so quite a large number, and 20% of your group profits are ordinary profits. So you have a lot of room to say, to blend, and to be then top competitive, because no jurisdiction in a way can be below, subject to certain exemptions. Of course, some might think now about substance-based income exclusion and so on and so on. But as a principle, what you see is, it's not this kind of 15%, everything. Have a look at the details. It's worth doing so, and this might trigger then also your whatever your political perspective, what to do, how to behave with the implementation of GLOBE, but also on the level playing field regarding your ordinary tax system. Yeah, having said that, this is an example very similar for France. On the left-hand side, on the right-hand side, you see using the Netherlands as a country for an IP box, isolated a cross-border situation. This doesn't work anymore, because you cannot blend in the Netherlands into France. But of course, you can do it within France. You can blend in France in a jurisdiction, but not cross-border. This is the message here. We spoke about it, the consequences, the potential consequences, because we don't know it, of the US G7 so-called side-by-side agreement. What might be the outcome? Question mark. I don't know it, but I can think about what could be the case. Therefore, you see everywhere question marks, yeah, because don't know, but what if something like that, or assume what, I wouldn't be surprised if this is or would be the outcome. And there are two examples, two structures in a way. The idea, if I understand it right, if I read the less lines we can read, and if I try to understand, maybe I don't, regarding what is the idea behind, then I understand that the idea is to declare in a way, to compromise that the US system, which have a similar system, that the US system might be, should be regarded as, you see the formulation, equivalent as the globe system. This is conjunctive, okay, to be clear. So what could be the case? Well, we have a US parented group, as it is called, and the second layer is a globe limited, so a company in a globe implementing jurisdiction. And afterwards, we have a no globe limited, whatever, a company in such a jurisdiction which does also not implement globe like the US. So, and we have the US, they are about 14%, so below 15. The globe jurisdiction, according to national law, 12%, and the no globe subsidiary, 10%. What happens? And if the US rules are regarded as equivalent to the globe rules, then the globe limited is declined, is not allowed. That could be the outcome to levy a top-up tax on the third level. So this 5%, no IIR, and is not allowed to tax 1% top-up tax the profits of the US limited. That might be the outcome. If that would be the outcome, US parented groups would be ruled out by the side-by-side agreement. Whether we like it or not, that's, I think, the idea, if I understand correct, maybe not. Second, you don't have a US parent. And I mean, this can be, of course, a BVI limited, for instance, just to mention. We have a globe limited on top, then a US interim and a company somewhere, also not introducing globe. The question is, can the top company having globe implemented do the IIR regarding company C and also regarding US? Also, this could be ruled out. So this is, let's say, on the floor, and we will see. But as I mentioned before, I would not be surprised if this is the result. I would be surprised if this is not the result. I would be even more surprised if people are surprised if this is the result. So a lot of surprises. Please. Oh, we need the microphone, I think. Yeah. Wait a second, please. The gentleman over there. A lot of potential surprises.
Thank you. The question is regarding the example with the US parent company. I don't know if it's feasible, but that comes to mind because the US recently announced as a possible commercial retaliation regarding a Europe sanction against one US large company. I think for publicity issues, something like that. But the issue here, or the question for tax is it possible, or do you see could be possible that the US tries to implement something unilaterally to stop the implement or to try to stop the full implementation of the global tax?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. Well, I think if I understand these what we know, this US, so G7 US agreement, then it is exactly, and it was left out, the countermeasures of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the OBBBA. The countermeasures were left out. So I assume, but not knowing what will be next day in the White House done, but I assume that they did it while relying on the side-by-side agreement with the expectation, that's how I understand it, of being regarded as equivalent. So I don't expect countermeasures. I rather could think about, if you saw the post of President Trump yesterday or the day before regarding US multinationals and fines and so on. How this is qualified, this might be another discussion, but I don't see too much room for further discussion and how to say attack against the implementation of GLOBE, because I mean a side-by-side agreement, rather vice versa, a side-by-side agreement like this would bring the US in a more competitive situation as GLOBE implementing countries. And would bring, if it is a US side-by-side agreement addressing the US system and not a system like the US, then it would bring the US in a way in a unique competitive situation, being best in class, and all others cannot be best in class because they have or follow the GLOBE rules. So that's, I think that's the tricky component, and it gives even the US, let's say, more comfort, more safety to be in this best-in-class position, which is of course not in line with GLOBE. But the question is, this is a political topic, and I think the focus is of how can we align the different things that don't come together per se. And that's fair enough as a political topic, and therefore I think the G7 and the OECD go that way. Good. Maybe I end with some comments on tax incentives. This is, besides the now side-by-side agreement topic, the other big topic we have with GLOBE, in a way of which incentives are addressed, impacted by GLOBE, tax incentives that reduce in a way the tax burden, and which are less or more or less not affected by GLOBE. And we see in principle income-based incentives are rather impacted, affected, cancelled out by GLOBE. The classical thing, IP box, or just a reduction of your tax rate. You have not 20% but 10%. Then, of course, this will be cancelled out by GLOBE with an additional top-up tax of 5%. There are other ones, also substance-based income exclusion. So if you have certain amounts of remuneration for people, and or certain levels of tangibles, then certain percentages are reduced from the excess profits insofar. And also other ones, these qualified refundable tax credit. So you get a tax credit of your country if you invest in research and development, and a certain percentage then can be used to offset from your corporate income tax as an incentive. And you see, this should not be addressed that heavily as the other ones in so far. I would go a little bit further here with 2-3 examples, and then I close. You see these formula, how to calculate the respective top-up taxes. You see the example of Ireland. They had these research and development QRTC, qualified refundable tax credit. The technique is here. It's a tax credit designed in a way such as that it must be paid as cash or equivalent within 4 years, when a constituent entity, a company, satisfied the conditions doing this research, for instance, for receiving the credit under the laws of the jurisdiction granting the credit. And if the tax is not enough to offset it, then they have to do payouts. So you also can think about any kind of grants. Countries just give money to companies, could be something similar. Okay, the Irish do so. They have these QRTC, and you see with that, in a certain situation, in an example, of course, this is, let's say, a frank example, they may end up in the same situation as there would have been no GLOBE. So their tax rate is 12.5%, and as we see here, the final result would be also 12.5%, although they apply GLOBE rules and others. And that's the interesting thing. If you have a QRTC, a qualified refundable tax credit, then the others regard Ireland as being in conformity with GLOBE, as if they would have levied 15%. That's the message. It's not 12.5 and then the other take a top-up tax of 2.5. This is enough, these 12.5, 2.5 because the tax incentive is in line with the globe rules. We have some information. We have not final administrative guidelines. What is how incentives should be dealt with, and so on and so on. We have some information regarding like the incentives should not be aligned with the globe rules that you just pay back what you levied before. So not having a top-up tax, 2.5%, and then giving it back to the taxpayer. Because of course, then this is not a top-up tax, and the magic term is the incentive related to globe? To make it very, very, very general, here you see it in more detail. Two examples more. One of Singapore, currently introduced and regarded by the inclusive framework, the OECD, as qualified, is a refundable tax credit. I think Colombia also has experience with that. But this refundable tax credit investment, refundable investment credit in Singapore is in a way also for companies that are in scope with globe. So for instance, expenditures in headquarter activities. This is something large companies have. A bakery around the corner usually does not have a headquarter in Singapore. So you can address it, and also with regard to who gives that grant, that it is the Singapore Economic Development Board, for instance, and they do it on a discretionary basis. So this is not an open parliament with debate and so on. You apply for, and they decide yes or no, and that could be a topic to say so, and then in the future we might see hallmarks, criteria, whatsoever, to classify is it an acceptable tax incentive or not. As we see with Singapore, at least in the transitional process, in the current process, better to say, so it is regarded as qualified. It didn't deter the qualification of the QDMTT of Singapore. One step even further is Switzerland, and there the canton of Zug, and they want to introduce, it's not the law yet, Switzerland is qualified, but they want to introduce also a QRTC, which is linked both expenditure, research and development, but also income. And income we saw is usually, let's say, not allowed or canceled out by Globe, but nevertheless they say, well, a QRTC can also be designed in a way that we take income perspectives. We don't know the outcome again, so let's see what the future brings, but it is very close to the edge. Maybe it is above the edge of conformity with globe rules. And with that, I'm thank you very much for listening to my keynote. Some thoughts we may now discuss further. And again, I'm happy to give back to Dr. Yona Oyeda. Thank you very much for your audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Martin. Well, with this keynote, we're going to open the discussion. The discussion is going to be divided in 5 parts. In the first part, we're going to speak about the implementation of Pillar 2, how feasible is its implementation. Then we're going to see the perspective of developing countries, also with some scenario of not developing countries, but that might be close to it. And then we're going to speak about tax competition, the challenge of its implementation, and then we're going to focus on the Colombian case. So first, well, here I'm going to be the one moderating the discussion. However, feel free to intervene as much as you want. First, the first subject is the implementation of Pillar 2. The guiding question here is what is the perspective of the global implementation of Pillar 2. We have seen so far that the US has its initial guilty that has been transformed, but that might pose some problems regarding the implementation of this. Give me a second. I think, yeah, just a second. Can we share the screen? Because we're going to have the participation of 2 panelists who are online. No. Sorry, just a second.
Okay.
Next question.
But no worries, Andres. You have the the time to ask as many questions as you want. Okay, now, so the first question is regarding what is your perspective of the implementation of this? We have the vision of different countries. We have European country, we have a MITE, we have a European Union country, we have a European country that is not part of the European Union, we have Latin American countries. So how do you see this is gonna be developed towards the future? Do you really think that we will implement this worldwide, or there is gonna be like some challenge to address regarding the perspective of the US, the implementation of GILTI, the implementation of other countries such as China, as Professor Martin remarked that before. So I don't know if you want to start, and then we give the floor to the others.
Yeah, well, first, just to as a remark, I speak, of course, in my personal capacity and not country-wise or continent-wise or so. Well, as we saw with the world map, that about more or less 60 plus countries and jurisdictions have implemented GLOBE. I expect, for the good, for the bad, that they will not abolish, that the compromise will not be challenged in a way that GLOBE will disappear. There's a lot of efforts done by many countries and jurisdictions, and these are very often either the one in the lead, let's take European Union member states, or they are the ones in the following. Let's take Singapore, Switzerland, and also Liechtenstein and others. I mean, the followers took this very seriously. What the global tax standard setters decided and brought on the table as the compromise. And in the inclusive framework, this was adopted or accepted, approved as the common standard. You can implement, you don't have to, but you can. And these countries and jurisdictions take things very serious and want to follow these rules, and they do very precisely with a lot of effort, and therefore I don't see this momentum that let's say a critical mass of countries will go the way to lead a new direction in the way of deleting GLOBE. I rather think that we see the side-by-side agreement, equivalence of the US system. I would not be surprised about that. And also with regard to tax incentives, I just mentioned Singapore, for instance, we see rather tax incentives that the inclusive framework is more relaxed with these kind of tax incentives and will give nevertheless the qualification to countries and jurisdictions introducing that. So GLOBE is not maybe so much one-to-one GLOBE, but a little bit more relaxed in the interpretation. Although not to be misunderstood, the Singaporean refundable investment credit is a clear QRTC and is fully in line in so far.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor. Don't know, Sulay, do you have any comment on this regard?
Yeah, I think that, yeah, the situation with the US is a quite challenge about the implementation, and it comes to how to become best in class by making others become the best in class, no? Because at the very beginning, the Biden administration was very keen on the implementation of Pillar 2, and somehow following that lead, most of the countries implemented their minimum, the qualified minimum tax. And now, well, with the new administration, some concerns are raised on whether that is completely aligned and that is completely clear with the interest of U.S. multinationals. So the government, together with the houses of representatives, start wondering, hey, how much benefit I am obtaining on applying these rules? I am actually like providing an actual benefit to my taxpayers that are the US multinationals, or I am just providing harmless to them. And I think that over that was construct this side-by-side agreement in which actually the US is making a point of I was already the best in class, guys. So I don't need to become the better one because I am already best in class. So in somehow now, as you mentioned, Professor, the US become now the most attractive jurisdiction in certain cases. And ironically, most of the US multinationals that inspired this set of rules, well, now will be covered by their own domestic laws that are quite beneficiary for them. And in regards to the Latin American framework, well, actually Latin America is more like a recipient of investment. So we will not find out a lot of Latin American multinationals that will be triggered the thresholds of income. But quite interesting, we will have a couple here in Colombia. We will have 2 or more, something like that. And then the analysis is different because as recipient of investors, we have developed qualified minimum taxes. So we have how to protect our tax systems. But now those Latin American multinationals have to think about how they are going to impact in their European countries where they have presence. So I think that that's a good relevant point. And the second one is we do have a lot of jurisdictions in Latin America that uses a territorial system that haven't not taken any steps regarding the implementation of Pillar 2. So now I wonder whether if they are seeing the US taking these bold steps, whether they will say, well, maybe I stay here like good. And I'm thinking on the case of Costa Rica that already makes some steps to adapt their trade-free zones to be considered like a compliant system, to be not considered as a tax harmless regime. And then now they are facing the challenge on whether with these new rules, they will be still considered a qualified minimum tax or not under the globe rules. So that's my point of view.
Thank you.
Well, I fully agree with your analysis. Maybe just to add, not to concur, to add, if there is, let's say, a first best solution and a second one, there might be also a third best solution only. And I think this is the question if you do not implement. And this will be always the case if your companies in a country that does not implement GLOBE are top-up taxed by another country. Because this revenue, of course, in the same competitive situation can be levied by the respective country itself, becoming then from third to second best. Yes, the US lead this case, first best, and so on. Totally agree with that. On the other side, we should not forget, these are, of course, certain examples. We cannot per se say the US are always better off. It depends on the example. The globe have the substance-based income exclusion. So it depends very much on the case, and probably last comment, there are other issues, but I don't want to, how to say, to bring the discussion absurd. There are maybe other topics, tariffs and security issues and many other things that might overlap this. But of course, if you have a holistic view on globe, which is correct and fine, and our focus today, then there might be this differentiation, but it is not a per se. It's not always so. So just to give us more hope to say so.
Thank you so much. Well, now I would like to have the participation of Maite, who comes from Spain, which is part of the European Union, which already implemented, well, is in the process of implementing the directive on this regard. So how do you see this towards the future? Do you really believe? I remember some discussion that we previously had regarding the disappearance of this proposal, not because I believe that it should disappear, but because there are a lot of comment in this regard. So I would like to know what's your perspective, Maite.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. So yeah, I bring the European Union perspective, the Spanish perspective. So just so you know, we already have the law implemented. As you all know, the European Union directives are mandatory to be transposed into the domestic legislation of all EU member states. So we did so late, but we complied with that obligation in December 2024. So it's quite recent. So when I addressed this question, which is, as Professor Ben said, it's everywhere, Pillar 2 and implementation and the outcomes, and it is, whether we like it or not, despite what we might think of that, it is a reality. We already have it here. So, but although it's inevitable, its future is uncertain. So, to your question, Joner, I have absolutely no idea what is going to happen, because, as also Professor Ben said, this is full of potential surprises. So this was a scenario that I don't think of anyone thinking about this outcome, or that a global implementing tax deal achieving so much in such short period. But here we are. So the approach that or my input in this perspective would be double. And I'm sorry, because I'm not that optimistic, and I'm not such a huge fan of the Pillar 2 and the global minimum tax. So in Spain, we have a saying that is a bad start leads to a bad ending. And also, I want to address this idea with the fact that I think that normally the questions rise in the international tax framework are not always right. So we keep looking back, but I don't think we look back for the right reasons. As I said, I have no idea of what is going to happen with Pillar 2, and I don't find any way to know it. So the only thing I can do is analyze what we already have and how did we get here. So I know the legitimacy debate about Pillar 2. How was it negotiated? How did this agreement, so-called agreement, finally reached? This is it might look a very theoretical debate, but it is not. And the US, as Professor Ben, and also as Zulay just told us, it's what's threatening threatening the implementation or the future implementation of its future. So my questions here will be, and I would like just to pose them. Why is the OECD, or on what grounds are the OECD, does the OECD claim a legitimate right to exercise authority? Because as Professor Ben said before, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, because the image freeze. As I was saying, as Professor Ben said, Is it because it's the only solution? Is it the best solution? Is it because there's no other alternatives? We know that the third option is not viable because we have the United Nations, which is a very, very viable option. But also we have the World Trade Organization. And also we have a deficit, legitimacy deficit regarding participation. And a clear example of that is the US. So we are, the rest of the world, basically, we are at the mercy of the US. So the Biden administration, as you all said, yes, we fully support the initiative because we already have that. As Zulay said, we are the best in class. So here they changed the government, and that's no longer suitable for the US. And from I was in Ghana in January 20 when the President Trump enacted this statement saying that he won't endorse the global minimum tax, especially the UTPR. And I thought I lost my thesis. But since I come from an EU country, let me tell you that it's very difficult to actually not apply or disregard a directive. It's possible, and since this Pillar 2 is already an achievement, never expected achievement, maybe it can get the EU to actually take it back, but it will have many effects for the EU member states because we, as I said, I think now all of us except for 2 member states already have the domestic minimum tax. So it will undoubtedly have effects. So I think as I said, and I keep saying, I don't know what's going to happen, but I don't think it's the Pillar 2 has a very, not long, might have a long life, but not a very successful life, just because of what we're seeing nowadays.
Thank you so much, Maite. Well, yep, yeah, there is a question. No, I will leave you.
Just a question for all the panelists. Do you see it possible as against another possibility in the future that we have basically just a lot of countries that do have an internal measure as Colombia and no coordination between the regimes? I think that is a plausible alternative. Or do you see possible a coordination between those internal regimes of minimum tax? What would be each of your opinion on that possibility in the future?
If I may, because that's one of my fears, that actually all of this debate about Pillar 2 will lead us to just have some country with domestic implementation of minimum tax, but not the income inclusion rules or the UTPR. And without those, personally, I see that at the end, Pillar 2 doesn't have any, it couldn't work, because as long as you have some countries that don't implement their minimum tax under the domestic legislation, and since we have the concept of residence, that's quite weak concept, then it's gonna be easy to move your residents towards those countries that are not implementing their minimum domestic tax, and while the purpose of Pillar 2 won't be fulfilled, is how I see. That's why I believe that the problem is not about competition. The problem is about the concept of residence, and we should jump into another nexus, or in a stronger nexus that is not residence. But well, I don't know, Professor Martin, you are making some faces. You have some comments on this regard?
Well, I see your point, not to stick only answering that, but to widen the picture, which is definitely a very good perspective. 2 comments maybe. In the current framework, I see especially that we end up with QDMTTs. So with domestic minimum taxes, but domestic minimum top-up taxes, not to evaluate them. They might be broader, this, that, but not just domestic minimum taxes, but with domestic minimum top-up taxes according to the globe rules being qualified. So to be clear, and a good example is Colombia, because you can very well study a domestic minimum tax, but again, the focus was not implementing globe. The focus was to have a minimum besides incentives, which is fair enough in a domestic topic. And we see, for instance, the position of Brazil in a way of, well, we don't want, and I think this is still my point, we don't want to become from the competitive and revenue situation. We have to look at it both, not to become in the third part, in the third level, in a way of we lose competitiveness because of IIRs and UTPRs somewhere else, but we do not levy the taxes. And I would call this as number three. Maybe just to mention, I'm not a fan of globe, I just deal with it. Third, we shouldn't, I think, make the mistake to think, yes, the Biden administration was in a way in favor of globe. They brought in the 15%. But during the Biden administration, we saw also not the possibility that the US legislator introduces globe. So the situation with the new US administration versus the result of the old administration is not at all new. It's rather a continuation of not implementing globe as a legislator.
Okay, I would like to give the floor to Oscar now to hear a bit about your perspective, and also maybe if you have some comment on regarding the question that was raised.
Thank you, Jenner. Thank you all for the invitation, for the participation. Indeed, the US participation in the globe rules was a big question mark from the beginning, and now that they have decided to not participate, it leaves more question mark regarding the future of the globe rules, that what in practice creates are a high level of complexity and a high level of compliance of international tax rules, and more than what they used to be. So having now a parallel system, what it's now being called a side-by-side system due to the leaked documents of the OECD a couple of weeks ago, what for sure will trigger is more complexity to the system, and an additional question mark regarding what is the real interest of, for example, the European Union to overregulate and to become way worse for their multinationals than the US multinationals that are already operating based on a guilty system, that they already have factored what is the meaning of having a guilty in their structure, rather than having multinational entities hiring advisors, paying huge amount of fees just to try to understand what is the potential implications, and not being quite sure how to comply with the rules, and where to file the relevant tax returns, and where to pay the relevant taxes in a high complex set of rules. And from the developing countries' perspective, the first answer that we had in the region was to kind of implement rules that allowed for tax collection in our countries. But probably we took the worst approach, and that was looking for tax collection. And nowadays that we have two systems, we will have to face the question whether that approach will in practice work in tax competitivity in the region, or rather we should change the approach to have tax incentive approach in order to have rules that promote investment and clear certain questions regarding complexity, tax compliance, whether the multinational entities have to review if a local minimum tax is considered as compliant or not. And especially from the perspective of multinational entities that for sure will not have to face those answers and to pay those high fees to just have a not that clear answer on what is their impact on their tax returns on a global basis.
Thank you, Oscar. And I would just make a little comment. Some of your question could be an exclamation, like more than a question. Now we're gonna pass to a second topic, which is what is the interest of the developing countries, which was one of the questions that was raised before by the audience. And the question that arises is actually, is this interesting for the developing countries? It is good to implement it. What is the interest? What could be the benefit? Or what could be the disadvantages of implementing this? I don't know if Sulay, you would like to address?
So I will say that at the end of the day, this 15% will be the new zero. So I think that then we will not have 0% rates. Then we will forget about those good times. But we will have this minimum tax rate that will be, I think that in certain way, it will be like the first step in the implementation of the globe rules. And I think that, as you mentioned, Professor, I think at the end of the day will be the easiest way to be aligned with this effort made by the OECD, and in a way to guarantee that if the profits will be taxed at a higher level, well, maybe I will have a little bit of the pie, and that's it. And then the other non-tax or the other benefits that may be aligned with the global rules will be in place. And there, I think that there will be the opportunity to become attractive again. And I think that in the region, then we will have these territorial systems that may take the position of doing nothing, and then the issue will be 2-3 levels above, where the multinational will implement a income inclusion rule, and then we will have a problem in the UK or in Spain or in France, and then the discussion will be how, and I having already these discussions on how could I take out that out of income inclusion rules. And I think that that's where probably the tax planning will move forward in regards to these countries in the region. What that will do anything, then it will become a problem of the parent entity, and therefore for sure tax planning alternatives will arise. And if there is not a coordinated implementation of the globe rules, well, the gaps will open, and then the opportunity to tax planning as always happens, no?
Thank you so much, Sulay. Would like to take the comment of Oscar, and because Maite is gonna comment on a specific case. So before jumping to that specific case, I would like to hear the comments on Oscar and then Professor Martin, who raised the hand.
Sure, Jonner. So from the developing countries, I think that it is the right moment to think about improving tax efficiency and tax certainty of their local tax rules. So the easiest way that the easier the rules that are implemented, the better for a developing country, because it would attract inversion. And also, it is a moment to think about how to structure appropriate tax incentives that are aligned either with the side-by-side system or with the globe rules. But those tax incentives that are fully aligned. For example, as Professor Martin was mentioning about the Singaporean one, for sure will make that country implementing those incentives highlighting in the full scope of the countries that are implementing the rules. And that would also work not only for the perspective of just creating tax incentives and attracting investment, but also for other non-tax purposes. So, for example, the creation of tax incentives based on investing in fixed assets or in qualified payroll. That is somehow the example that we have seen in some Caribbean countries that were fully outside of being compliant from the globe rules, and that by implementing certain tax incentives, certain attractive tax incentives, they are not only being an attractive country from the tax perspective, but also attracting new employment and new investment in the country that for sure should be a high focus for developing countries.
Thank you, Oscar. Now, Professor Martin.
Yes, first of all, I fully agree with what Oscar has said. I think this is exactly the next step in a way to think what can be done individually in the respective country to find, let's say, a better composition, a better position in so far. Maybe just very short comments on what has been said. Of course, I mean the benchmark system, the globe system, is not a is not a system without problems or so. It's a compromise. It has the idea of addressing base erosion, profit shifting, of curbing, flooring, limiting tax competition. But these are the ideas. This is not 100% fulfilled by the system. It's more a framework. What could be positive? Why countries think about it in a positive way? Let's take EU member states, for instance. Of course, there was and still is base erosion, profit shifting across borders. This could be limited because of there is no blending, or the blending is becoming more difficult. There's no cross-border blending, but there's domestic blending, and therefore, of course, substance and favorable taxation can be brought back to some countries where a blending is possible. France, as an example, with a higher tax rate, 25%, but also in an IP box, it's the perfect match to say so, to blend high and lower taxed profits within the system. The 15 is the new 0. Yes, I fully agree with that in a way, but there might be circumstances that also 0 tax countries with substance in a standalone position or whatsoever are able to still offer so. And let's think about not the traditional business, but also regarding digitalization, service, and so on. Digital business, especially products and so on, might be developed in the future, even now, in jurisdictions which are highly attractive also on the personal side in countries that don't levy taxes at all, and from this perspective, not being an M&E, not fall into the scope, of course, there might still be the possibility to use a 0, although we have a very, very comprehensive implementation of globe, more or less worldwide. And yeah, having said that, I think it is the focus, exactly as Oscar mentioned, to focus on the respective country, what fits to the respective country, in a way that we know the level playing field is not a level playing field to relax, It is a level playing field that is highly competitive, that has similar rules like globe. They are a compromise. Tax incentives are possible. Many things are possible. And so I think it's important to draw the attention to the opportunities and to focus on that and what fits best to a country regarding the economic situation, and also which kind of nexuses do exist that are able to be taxed. And then even the zeros or 15 as the new zero is not is maybe not that important anymore.
Thank you so much, Professor Martin. And finally, as I mentioned before, Maite is gonna mention the case of Canary Islands. She made a research on this, and she obtained a prize on this research. So could you comment a bit about it?
Yeah, sure. I decided to address this issue here to bring the Canary Islands, which is a very specific regime in this.
Maite, sorry to interrupt. We hear you a bit with some problems. I think maybe your earphones, they're touching something.
Better?
Go for it.
Do you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So I decided to bring the Canary Islands example here.
We have again the problem.
Oh God.
I don't know if the problem comes from us or from you. I'm gonna check here.
Okay, thank you.
Try to speak again.
Now, better?
Yeah, better.
Okay. So why the Canary Islands example? Because it's always been said that there were clear winners and losers in of Pillar 2, and that's not so. So the so-told winners are developed economies, while developing countries are the losers. So as Oscar and also Martin just said, it requires a country by country analysis, not just generalized, because developing countries are so different. But I want to bring attention on the Canary Islands example because it shows that also developed economies can be negatively affected by the Pillar 2. So for all of you who doesn't know it, the Canary Islands has a special tax regime because, as you know, it's a Spanish region, but it's an island, and it's very far from the peninsula. It's 4 hours flight or something like that. It has specific climate conditions, of course, and it has structural and socioeconomic disadvantages. So for that reason, their special tax regime, which basically consists of a reduced corporate income tax rate of a 4% for certain enterprises that carry out development, investment, create jobs within that territory. They can benefit from that reduced tax rate. So until the global minimum tax, it was perfectly compliant with European Union stated rules and also with the OECD report on harmful tax competition. The last one was the BEPS Action 5. But what does the global minimum tax change in this respect? So now, as you all know, the only thing that matters is the effective tax rate of multinationals, or here in the EU, also purely domestic groups, does not fall below the 15%. So of course, the 4% is below that. So that will require the Canary Islands to abolish this regime, or simply to apply a top-up tax of an 11% just to comply with the global minimum tax. What does this entail for, of course, for the Canary Islands? The loss of its main tax attractiveness. So in the work that Joner said, I examined 3 potential options or mechanisms or ways that actually are within the globe proposal that can help mitigate that effect. So, and as Oscar and Martin just said, I don't know if it can be transposed to or applied to, and to what extent it will help other regions or jurisdictions, but the substance-based income exclusion, the qualified refundable tax credits, and also the jurisdictional blending can help mitigating that effect, because by applying them when it is possible, of course, because these need to that the company needs to meet certain requirement, can reduce the top-up tax. So the difference between the 15% and that aforementioned 4% corporate income tax. So that will help, or that will somehow strengthen the Canary Islands competitiveness in the international framework. Although and as I previously said, I'm not a global minimum tax fan, and I think that despite it can be mitigated and it should be, of course, considered, I don't think it's justified in the case of the Canary Islands.
Thank you so much, Maite. Well, this gives a bit of interaction to see how the different perspective of what's going to happen with this and what are the expectations of this is, because as Professor Cesar mentioned at the beginning, it might not be interesting for some countries, depending also on political issues. You have a comment?
Yeah, well, thank you, Maite, for your very interesting comment, and also for the study, including regional perspective. I think that's very important. Besides always the global picture. But maybe two comments or two or three. First of all, of course, I mean, per se, the Canary Islands still have their competitive advantage compared to the Spanish national rate of 25%. Second, exactly as you mentioned, there's this opportunity of blending within Spain, including the Canary Islands, of course. So 4 with 25, there's a lot of room to blend to come up to 15. And insofar we see again the globe rules are not so puristic as we think about at first instance. And also, what do we expect from the application? I mean, a global minimum tax does not affect a tax rate, tax burden that is clearly below 15. Of course, there might be an impact, but again, it's there's room. You mentioned the substance-based income exclusion. So if substance is related in so far, the rules are not so, how to say, so not so puristic again. And therefore, I mean, this is the new framework, and within the new framework, of course, the Canary Island may live with that the competitive advantage is still there but reduced. It can be used to blend, or of course, because I think this is not a status quo perspective. Of course, also one can think, well, instead of the 4%, what else can be done in the Canary Island as a tax incentive to enhance or to safeguard the competitiveness? And I think this is exactly what happens, this very dynamic level playing field. And it is extremely challenging. There are opportunities, but it is extremely challenging. And this is, let's say, the new world that you are in this kind of power play. And because others are so much in the power play, you are in a way forced to think at least about what should I do for my country, for my jurisdiction, but exactly on the basis of the analysis of Maite, and again, thank you so much.
Sorry,
Thank you, Professor Martin.
Jonah, could I make just
Maite?
a small comment on Martin's comment?
Sure.
Okay, just very brief. Just so precisely in my work, I conclude that the Canary Islands might have a unique position because despite all the negative effects that it might level it might lose the 4% and of course it has to reevaluate all its tax system. That's what they're doing now. The opportunity for you, for example, you mentioned blending. For that to apply, that will require or that will only apply to those groups that have at least one constituent entity in the peninsula and one in the Canary Islands. So that again, there are mechanisms to that's why I mentioned or that I call them mechanisms to mitigate the effect, because they don't fully leave the good competitive advantage. Also the same with the substance-based carve-out and also the qualified refundable tax credit. The first has a 5%, it will be gradually increased, but still up to a 10%, which I find but in broader terms, so like the substance-based carve-out, I think it's at all lights insufficient. And also the qualified refundable tax credit, as you mentioned, needs to meet some requirements. So yes, there are mechanisms, yes, there are ways, but they're all limited. But although, or despite that, I still sustained that the Canary Islands has a unique position. So despite all of that, thank you.
Thank you, Maite. Well, now let me go to the third point. When we started to speak about Pillar 2, one of the main points that was, or one of the main objective was to reduce the tax rate, no, the rate towards 0%, like you mentioned before, which is harmful tax competition between countries. The question that I would like to raise is actually Pillar 2 is gonna fix that problem. It's gonna help us to fix that problem of harmful tax competition between countries. I would like to start by Oscar, taking into account the participation before. What is your personal consideration? Do you really see that the harmful tax competition among countries is going to be reduced by this, or is going to be tackled by this?
No, Joner. Indeed, I think that the tax competition between countries will change, and what the global rules is creating, and now with the side-by-side system, what it is creating is in fact the necessity for countries to create certain rules that would help the multinational entities to circumvent the potential adverse impacts of the global rules under each one of their jurisdictions where they operate. And what it will trigger for sure will be a numerous amount of rules, either triggered or either designed in order to have a new minimum tax of 15%, similar to the way Colombia is doing, but with the issues of whether this is qualified or not, and other constitutional and political issues around the rules, and other countries having another approach, implementing tax incentives aimed to increase their substance, ways to have substance without having any substance in that country. So what I fully think is that it will not reduce the tax competition, and it will not reduce harmful tax competition, but it will change the way that tax competition will happen between the countries.
Okay, thank you, Oscar. I would like, you mentioned something about the new tax competition, as now the 15 is gonna be the new 0%. So do you think that this is gonna change the competition field in the sense that there is gonna be less harmful tax competition, or we just redefine the harmful tax competition?
I will say that maybe it will not be harmful in a way that it is not be the race on how to create a BEPS situations or how to create a double non-taxation situations. But definitely, and I think that the competition maybe will expand to a non-tax environment, in where every single step that makes the jurisdiction more attractive may be taken into account, since we will have a playing field where the rules will be quite relevant in each other. So every single benefit, either tax or non-tax, for instance, customs or any other type of tax or any other type of benefits, will be considered in this analysis on whether the jurisdiction becomes attractive or not. So I will say that hopefully it doesn't becomes again harmful, but definitely jurisdictions are still in need of investors. So they will need to come up with new alternatives of having a new benefits to offer to the investors, either tax, but the tax then must be aligned with the globe rules, if so, or non-tax if that's available, right?
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Martin has been waiting for this moment.
Yeah, well, maybe just some short remarks insofar. I mean, race to the bottom. Yeah, I showed it by myself, and I mean the current situation is, according to BEPS, a zero taxation is not regarded to be harmful according to the BEPS standards if it is in combination with substance. So that's one point. Whether we like it or not, these are standards. This is not the ideal world. We should be careful not to overestimate it. It's just what it is. Not more, not less. So it's not a dreamland, to say so. I mean, globe and is an idea against BEPS, is an idea to floor tax competition, but it doesn't rule out BEPS, it doesn't rule out tax competition. And we just heard how to safeguard the competitive position, the unique position of the Canary Island. If we think, let's say, idealistically, there cannot be a better, more competitive position with a lower tax, neither in the Canary Island nor elsewhere, whether it is a nice or a not nice island. It would be ruled out entirely. But it is not so ideal and not so ruling out everything. There might be options, just to be kind of let's say realistic. What is the point is, of course, and then we see maybe the drama. If there is a lot of substance-based income exclusion, whether we like also this rule or not, there might be even a zero top-up tax on a zero taxation in a country which has included GLOBE or is affected by GLOBE. So that's possible. And also with regard to tax incentive grants and so on, let's say a lot is possible, and this exactly, and it was mentioned before, triggers the tax competition, let's say 2.0, 3.0, 4.0. And of course, within this super complex world, we have a kind of a floor, we address BEPS, but it is not ruled out, not at all. Rather, it is, let's say, it gives the floor for more complex, for more sophisticated ideas, how to behave in this new adapted level playing field, and then a lot of opportunities are possible, especially on a domestic perspective because of the blending, and so on and so on and so on. And I think this is the current thing. What we see in a way in, let's say, this plain vanilla structure, there's a multinational and one of the companies or several companies are situated in GLOBE countries. Then of course the QTMTT, let's say, jumps seriously in, and if you want to safeguard not only your profits but also your tax revenue, then it is what the most countries do. They implement at least this QTMTT thing, but they don't stop with that.
Thank you so much. We have a question here.
Yeah, I don't know how pertinent regarding the last issue this question could be, but since the discussions about Pillar 2 are usually handled in the context of multinational companies, but as you mentioned a little bit, some impact on individuals, just keep that part on your presentation. But my question is regarding that. Do you guys see a direct impact of these new rules that are being implemented in different countries regarding, for example, high net worth individuals? Do you see a direct impact there, or this is something that should concern more multinational companies as it is addressed in the regulation?
Who would like to take over?
Yeah, well, we already see a kind of a certain momentum. I mean, proposals, let's take this idea of a global minimum wealth tax, which should not be a wealth tax, but rather to boost a rather comprehensive income taxation of ultra high net worth individuals. It was presented in 2024 in Brazil in front of the G20. OECD mentioned it in their report to the G20 that they want to take more care about effectively tax ultra high net worth individuals. We see a lot of increasing tax competition by many attracting regimes, resident by investment, global visa, citizenship, lump sum taxation, territorial tax system, let's say by nature. So countries who have a territorial tax system are by nature attractive for people who have only foreign income. We saw let's say the discussion in the UK with the abolishment of the non-dom regime, and so on and so on. So this is another highly competitive level playing field. And we see countermeasures by countries, exit taxes that are levied, trying to implement other kinds of wealth taxes. Inheritance taxes are in the focus. So this is another level playing field where we see, of course, let's say very competitive, attractive, and so on countries and jurisdictions, and other trying to safeguard their taxing rights. And therefore, again, I wouldn't wonder, for me, it's rather clear that also this group is in addition to multinationals and is in the focus and becoming even more in the focus of international tax policy. And I think we are behind regarding multinationals. So we are more in the way of anti-avoidance. What is avoidance is enhanced. So-called loopholes are closed. Why did you have these loopholes? Another topic, but not to mention here. So yes, I see this point. Very last point. The global minimum tax for multinationals, of course, encourages people who have ideas to say, can't we introduce in other fields of taxation also global minimum taxation with all, let's say, the good and all the bad and all the problems, but at least they can say, well, but there is a system, and in a way it is on the way, or it is already being introduced. And again, tax systems, however you design it, they will never be perfect.
Thank you so much, Professor. Indeed, actually, my thesis paper is on C1 and is also inspired by this idea of having a global minimum taxation. In this case, a pricing minimum, a global minimum pricing. Well, I would like to address the fourth subject, which is in case of implementation, and I think that's a question that could be addressed mainly from the European perspective. What are the main implementation challenges that this has, which could serve us here in order to see how we could face those challenges? Although we have implemented a kind of QMDTT, but it's not the same as a Pillar 2, although I'm anticipating the last subject. So I would like to address this question to Maite, and Professor Martin, you would like to start, and then I go with Maite?
Yeah, well, I mean, there has been a lot of discussions on the directive, and I don't want to jump in too much in that, whether this directive was needed, was a good idea, and so on. It was more an EU topic. Are all member states requested to implement, or some had kind of a timing perspective if they have not enough numbers of ultimate parent entities, and so on and so on. Of course, the European Union could have lived, I suppose, also without this directive, and many of the member states would have implemented it as well. Now you see, of course, if the standards, let's say, develop further, that it is quite, how to say, a challenge to amend also the directive, and so on. I think the implementation, so it's quite interesting to see European Union member states implementation being very complex with own rules in own national globe acts versus, for instance, the approach of Switzerland, which is more a reference legislation, reference to the globe rules. The latter is let's say the advantage, the beauty, to say so, is that you are always on the level of the globe rules. The problem is you have a kind of a dynamic reference, which is a nightmare for let's say puristic lawyers, and which is a fact for pragmatic ones. And with that you can interpret everything in and out.
Thank you so much, Professor Martin. Maite, do you have any comment in this regard?
Yeah, very, very short. Yeah, so the EU, maybe most of the EU member states implemented this initiative, but since the proposal came from France and Germany, being the US guilty proposal, but it was pretty easy to guess that we were going to be there. Of course, the first ones there. So for us as member states, not as the EU, at the institutional level, it was pretty easy, the transposition, because it was just a mere transposition. So if you see the EU directive is basically a copy of the globe model rules with regard to the calculation systems, with the taxable base, and so on. And with the difference that we have, as Professor Benz already said, we have the EU law, which has the non-discrimination principle. So we had to include purely domestic groups, not just multinational groups. Of course, this represents a disadvantages for us, and also more compliance and a bigger burden, administrative burden for also purely domestic groups, which have to also or are also subject to the global minimum tax. So and I don't think that the difficulties have changed from the beginning or from the when the Pillar 2 was developed until now, because the technical complexity still the same. Every day we have more and more comments, which I don't think anybody can understand. And these triggers, as Oscar just said, these triggers the big multinationals have to either train their employees or hire experts that can deal with the amount of formal obligations. And we share, Latin American, EU countries, we all share this. So, but as I said previously, and this is my huge problem with the global minimum tax, the main issue that the Pillar 2 has, the global minimum tax at the domestic level now, is that it has to, in the domestic level, overcome the legitimacy issues that it has. So I don't know how is it going to be made, or how is it going to be achieved. So apart from the technical difficulties, the administrative burdens, we also always will have these complexities. So that's my point of view.
Thank you so much, Maite. Now I'm going to address my other two panelists on the Colombian case. I would like to, we have before there was any directive in the EU, Colombia raised the hand and said, we're going to implement something in relation to the Pillar 2. At least is how it was introduced, how it was exposed in the introduction of the provision. And then they came with a first proposal. This proposal was amended based on some comment that because they say we're going to tax on a 50 minimum tax, but they didn't give any definition of what was supposed to be 15 minimum tax. And then they introduced a formula that has raised some questions. They also apply this on a broader sense, not following the initial proposal just on multinational. And there are some characteristics of the Colombian case that raise to some questions. And the first question is that whether this is consistent with Pillar 2, then what are the main legal and constitutional challenges that this law might have currently in Colombia? Actually, we have some cases that have been taken by the Constitutional Court and are pending, and we're waiting to see what's going to be the final result. So I don't know if you would like, Oscar, you would like to start first, since it has been a long time I haven't heard about him. And then we go with Sulay. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Jenner. So, yeah, I would say that Colombia is the perfect example of that the fact that being the first one is not always the best and the best idea, and that is because we implemented a rule when it was just starting to being developed, and the worst is that we implemented it in a broader scenario that it was thought and that it was designed. So that led to the fact that it triggers a lot of concerns for Colombian taxpayers, not for multinational entities based in Colombia, but for all corporate Colombian taxpayers, because of certain flaws on its design. The most important one, the fact that it does not consider the impact of the deferred taxes on the tax liability that is triggered based on the Colombian domestic tax, the domestic minimum tax. So that being said, I think that the implementation of that rule basically ratifies that Colombia never thinks about tax competitivity and what is the real effect on taxpayers regarding complexity, regarding tax collection on a way that is compliant with the constitutional principles, but rather decides to implement some rules and then decide to the Colombian Constitutional Court to check whether they are compliant with the Constitution, and for the taxpayers to issue some legal concerns about that. And that also with some comment that the OECD just recently issued some list of qualified legislations for purposes of the safe harbor. The OECD clearly states that the fact that a legislation is not included there does not mean that it will not be considered as a qualified legislation for purposes of the safe harbor, but it is quite loud, the message that the Colombian domestic minimum tax is not included so far yet, being one of the first responses for the Pillar 2 implementation.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Now from Sulay, I would like to hear what are your comments on this Colombia initiative.
Yeah, I think that I am fully aligned with Oscar. I will add that, yeah, it was a very, very bad tryout on implementing. Of course, when you see all the background of the law that introduced this minimum tax, that say the explanations provides that they are inspired on Pillar 2, and they try to tackle all the issues that are addressed under Pillar 2, but the way that they did it, it was not good, and I think that it is not, in my personal view, it is completely far away from the provisions of Pillar 2. I think that the only thing that we may share is the 15%, but the other topics, I think that we are far away, being the starting point that the rules were quite broad, even including all income taxpayers. So this includes small to medium companies that absolutely were not the target for these measures. And here we included also national groups and companies, not on the grounds of discrimination, it was on the grounds of higher collection. So that's the other point. And I agree with Oscar that the formula is completely doesn't understand most of the mechanics of income tax, because that way of not recognizing all the temporary differences book to tax and doesn't solve that issue, then creates a distortion between the companies that somehow had it's a regular in their business to have book to tax differences in regards to companies that, because of the sector, may don't have it or have it more permanent differences on the fair tax. So I hope that the Constitutional Court, in this new opportunity that they have to review the constitutionality of the article and the formula, that recognize this distortion, and especially on the grounds on those temporary differences that I think that we all agree that is the most significant and relevant difference for the implementation of in regards to the global rules and our minimum tax.
Well, to close, I don't know how familiar you are with the Colombian rule, but if you have any comment on this regard, it would be welcome.
Well, I have quite sympathy with the rule. You may be surprised. I don't take only the position to provoke, but I have a kind of a sympathy to the rule. In principle, I mean, it's a political perspective, of course, to say, well, there obviously some pay for whatever reason less than 15%. Therefore, let's floor the tax competition. The idea is in a way similar than the one of Globe. It's a domestic one. I mean, you can do that in your country. And of course, then, and to become clear again, I mean, to review it and to think about, well, was the idea good? Then maybe go for it or draft a legislation. If you're still convinced with all the analysis, implement it, and afterwards, of course, review it. And I think this is the way it can be done, it should be done, not to give advice or so, but it is, how to say it, it can be a way. The idea is again similar than the Globe. Whether the rules are good or bad is not in my capacity to evaluate that. Not at all, but it might be an interesting thought in so far. And of course, we also see how how really challenging it is if we go ahead with, Oscar mentioned it, with over-regulation. He meant the EU. I mean, more regulation. To have a domestic minimum tax is more than to have non-domestic minimum tax. And we always have to take care, and that's maybe my last point also with GLOBE, we have to take care. We can do a very, how to say, simple implementation of GLOBE with kind of reference law. This is not so much to do to say so. Maybe I oversimplify it now, but we should never forget the burden is on the companies. They have to live with that. They have to administer that. Oscar mentioned it. Tons of money for people, for service, which is fantastic for the service industry, advising industry, and so on. They might be happy with all these regulation. Of course, they give advice on it, but it's a cost factor on the M&E or on domestic ones like the domestic minimum tax. And is it worth? Or is it maybe also a sign, if you reflect, to say, well, it was an idea, maybe even a good idea from a political perspective, but cannot we include this minimum tax thinking in a more sophisticated way in our ordinary rules, so that we do not need this kind of minimum tax? These are just some thoughts. It's not precise. It's not giving advice to other countries or things like that. Don't misunderstand me. But therefore, and also maybe for the young people here, it's so important to think about these rules. And what is good is to have better rules than less good rules. And therefore, it's quite important to challenge it.
Thank you, Professor Martin. I think we can discuss on some point, but thank you for your closing remarks. I don't know, Sulay, Oscar and Maite, I will give you the floor to have some closing remarks. And with this, we end the event to stick on the time so you can have lunch.
Thank you, and thank you, Joner, for organizing this panel. Thank you for the university to give us the space to have this discussion. I think that in any ways these are very exciting moments that we will see how the story ends, how the US ends up with the analysis, or where we have to say a case-by-case analysis, of course. And I think that in the agenda, there is still a lot of in the plate, since there are a lot of countries, especially in this part of the continent, that have not implemented or moved forward towards Pillar 2. So that I think that from my perspective, these are exciting moments to see how the next move would be, and how all the actors in this environment react as a service provider, more advisory to provide, and the academia, and of course for the multinationals and even local groups that are impacted by this type of rules.
Thank you, Zulay. Maite, the floor is yours for the closing remarks.
Thank you, Joner. So just very briefly, this, as we said, this redefinition of tax competition that undoubtedly the global minimum tax post will also, like Zulay said, excite me in the sense that where will tax competition now move forwards? It's been said in the crowd that what happens with individuals? Well, maybe this sets a precedent for now individuals. I highly doubt so, but it can be. Also, Zulay said before, maybe non-tax incentives now are the main actors or the main protagonists in the international tax scenario. I end by saying the same as I started, whether we like it or not, we have to deal with the reality, and the reality is that Pillar 2 is here. But also we have to look at the bright side of that, which is that it allows us to reevaluate in a jurisdictional and also institutional, in the EU case, also globally, the international tax framework, because you said that there are some principles that need to be strengthened. I fully agree with that. So maybe this super big and promising solution wasn't necessary after all, and just a strengthening of the already existing taxing principles and solutions would have been enough. I would like to again thank you, Joner, thank you, Professor Castro Arango, and thank you, the Tax Department of the University of Externado de Colombia, for this opportunity.
Thank you, Maite. And finally, Oscar, the floor is all yours.
So I totally agree with what Maite and Sulay were mentioning. It is quite clear that the game has not finished yet, and moreover, the cards are not yet fully on the table. So it is quite uncertain on a good way. And what is the future of these rules? That meaning that there is still a lot of work to do by the countries in order to implement good and interesting and of course attractive rules in order to create systems that work in the most efficient way possible. And of course that would trigger a lot of questions and debates from our perspective, from the Colombian perspective, on what are the rules that we should implement and how to create incentives in certain sectors or for certain industries that could be aligned with whatever the final rules and that would end up applying in this scenario.
Thank you, Oscar. Well, thank you, Professor Martin, Sulay, Maite, and Oscar. And well, thank you all of you for having attended this meeting. It was such a pleasure to share this conversation that is not stopping here. It's probably going to continue. And we see different positions in some regards. And voila. Thank you so much. And now, well, we can proceed. We are going to have a second session in the afternoon, but that's mainly meant to be for undergrad students. That will be done by Professor Martin Wentz, and it's going to be in room C106 in the old building, which is for me also as beautiful as this one, even more beautiful. So thank you so much, everyone. Maite, Oscar, are you there?